Well, good evening, and we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, and this is going to be the end of this series on the Cruciform way, and it's been helpful for me, and I hope it has been something. If you've stuck with it this long, I'm going to guess that it has been something that you've appreciated, and I hope truly is beneficial. I'm going to give a couple minutes for people who are taking the opportunity to come on live. Just so you know, I'm flying solo tonight for a couple reasons. Sean Bassler, who has been kind of like my producer, and she's able to look at any comments or anything like that coming in, has training tonight for the Alpha Weekend that's happening this weekend. And so encourage you to be praying for this weekend and the people who are participating in our online alpha. And the other part is that I had a small cough today. My throat was a little bit scratchy, and so I have practiced social distancing, and so would have been flying solo tonight no matter what. And in one part, what this means, if you are joining live, I'm not going to be able to see any of the comments, and it kind of doubly sad because I have a plan for tonight, and I'll share it with you in just a moment. I'm going to give just another minute or so for people to come on live, and if you are watching at a later time, I want to just say thank you and continue to encourage anybody to send me an email and just let me know what this experience was like, what stood out to you, what was most helpful. The next step for me in all of this stuff is putting forward that goal of writing a book. And I think that there's stuff here that's worthwhile, and it's a big part of why I've been doing all of this. Gonna take a drink. And I'm going to sit back a little bit more because, what I thought about today, Kathy Sands was the one who suggested this, and I want to say thanks, Kathy. And she was like, could you maybe just do like a one-time talk where you just kind of put this all together? And and a little bit inspired by TED Talks. TED Talks tend to be 10 minutes, and I'm going to take a little bit more than 10 minutes. And in that, I decided I want to approach this more like a conversation. And, I'll poke a little fun at pastors. We're not always the best conversation partners because we have the tendency to talk so much, and maybe not listen enough. And this is definitely not going to help because it's going to be kind of a one-sided conversation because I'm going to do a lot of talking. But picturing here more this opportunity to sit back and to really say, humility and leadership, do they go together? How do we understand this as Christians? Why is this important? What does it matter? And then how might it be done? And so I want to begin with just talking actually about a little bit about leadership. So I believe that in one sense, leaders are made and not born. I believe that, but at the same time, I believe that we all have a call in some way towards leadership. And this is something where this topic, this issue, each one of us being concerned about growing in our ability for leadership is significant. I believe that God has created each one of us as image bearers. And in that role of demonstrating his character, shining his light, the Bible is putting forward a picture where, in some way, we are co-rulers with God. That what it means for us to be an image bearer is that we activate the reign of God present within our sphere of influence, and so I believe that you are called in some way for leadership, to exercise the reign of God in your sphere of influence, as a positive force of trying to help other people move forward and understand how to live and thrive and grow, and order coming out of chaos, and life flourishing. And if we listen to God's call in our life, if we live up into who He has made us to be, we're going to have that opportunity to exercise leadership, whether it's in the home, or whether it's in the workplace, or whether it's in church, whether it's just among a group of peers and friends. We have an opportunity in some way to assert influence. And then if you're called to be a leader, then what kind of leader are you going to be? And obviously Jesus is calling us to be somebody like Him, a good shepherd, a good leader, somebody who is worthy of following. Now, that gets back to this issue of, at the same time, I think leaders are more made than born, in the sense that I think that really good leaders end up working at it. It's hard. You're going to struggle. There'll be failures, but you're going to come at this with a certain attitude that I'm going to learn from my failures. It's really not about me failing. It's about me persevering, because this is a hard thing. It's a life's work. This is really about who I am as a person, and then in that who I am as a person, this is what I came to do, and it makes a difference in some way. And if you're somebody sitting and leadership doesn't come easy to you, if the idea of this is kind of like maybe for other people but not for me, or I kind of prefer a quiet life than having to be out in front of the spotlight. Well, I can relate with that. I love to read books. I like to study. And one of the things that I prayed through and thought about was just being, a college professor and teaching, and that wasn't God's call in my life. And all of those things have an opportunity in some way of still being a leader. But at the end of the day, we're not called to comfort. We're called to something that's going to stretch us and grow us, we're going to have to lean on God, and we're going to have to pray, and it's not going to be easy. We're going to sometimes fail, and in that process, we're going to become more. And so, you may not really feel like, I'm the leadership type. But leaders don't all look the same. There's lots of ways to lead, and to lead well. But one of the absolute essential things to leadership, regardless of however you want to define leadership, everybody agrees character is important. It's not the only thing, but it is absolutely essential. Now, none of us have a perfect character. None of us have our acts all together. All of us have flaws and fracture points, and those will weaken us in our leadership. But if you want to be a good leader, you're going to focus on character. And there's going to be certain, and this is the part, people will have their lists, and there are often, divergence of opinions. you'll hear some things that are probably kind of grouped together as significant. Courage, integrity, intelligence, vision. Those tend to be some of the characteristics. And whoever's and whoever's offering their leadership is going to offer some of the things that they think are absolutely essential, and well, they should. And that's where part of this is that this isn't about personality type. This is about character, and there are some characteristics that leaders need, and so I want to talk to you about humility, because humility often doesn't come to mind for people when we think about leadership. In fact, in some circles, leadership and humility are seen as to be separate, as actually opposites. That somebody who's a leader really can't be somebody who's always self-doubting and thinking less of themselves, because there's a certain type of courage and boldness that you need to have to be a good leader. And so in some circles, leadership and humility seem opposites. And then there's also this reality that one of the things that happens in leadership is that leadership elevates you, and humility is about being low. And so they also tend to sometimes appear mutually exclusive. And now, that we have that attitude out in the world, I think, is understandable. But if we're in the church and we're talking as Christians about leadership, well, that becomes that becomes a harder thing to hold together. As Christians, we sit there and we go, okay, so Jesus is our greatest leader. That's when we say Lord, we're saying that he's the one who is leading us, that fundamentally we're giving him first place to direct our lives. And Jesus came as the humble one. So for Christians, we don't have... It's easier for us to get to the place of saying, okay, leadership and humility. But the problem is not with the idea of do leadership and humility go together. As Christians, it's easy to see. The problem really is our understanding of humility. And and this is what, there was a couple of things that drew me into this. One is okay, I've been called to a role of leadership, and it's not, leading wasn't like the top of the list. I don't have to lead, but there is this part of my own personality where I want to do things well, and I want to serve the Lord with all that I have, and I want to do a good job, and so I want to be a good leader. But I'm also competitive, and I want to do well, and it raises in me this sense of competition that I know can be detrimental, especially just to my own character, my spiritual life, my relationship with Jesus. And so how do I cultivate humility when I'm called to be a leader, and I have this sense of ambition and drive and desire, and at the best of it, I want to do it for the Lord. And so that's what drew me into this. Okay, so I've been called, and I'm in a position of leadership, and one of the dangers that I face in leadership is pride, and this sense of ambition and wanting to do great, and then thinking too highly of myself, and so that began my own personal pursuit about thinking about this humility and leadership. And then I mean, one of the other things that really drew me in is, okay, so called to be a leader, following Jesus means humility. I need humility in my life because the way that I'm wired, there's going to be pride, there's going to be ambition. I want to be better than other people, and that idea of being better, that's not Christ-like. I should want to be who God wants me to be, and so I've got to work on that. And then the other thing in this is that humility, when you see it, it's beautiful. When you see somebody who has accomplished great things, but they're not self-focused, they're not egotistical, they're not prideful or arrogant or defensive. They have ability, they have insight, they have wisdom, but you like being with them because they're not even focused on themselves. Yeah, that type of person helps me see Jesus. And those are the types of people that I would be willing to follow. And then you start to sit there and you go, humility and leadership. I mean, humility, it has that ability to really influence a sense of, okay, I like this person. I want to be with them. So, I'm standing there and I'm thinking about this humility and leadership and the call and my own weaknesses and cracks and flaws, and then the call to leadership, and then the call to humility, and so that inspired me to begin to dig into this. And then this is where it kind of comes full circle as we start to look at humility. Is well, there's not a lot written about it. It's not. It hasn't been extremely popular in our culture. The way that humility so often gets defined as thinking less of yourself is at odds with a therapeutic culture that is all worried about self-esteem and not having a negative self-image. And just as one part of this push of humility out, and that's part of where, from a secular standpoint, leadership and humility, if you're defining humility as this idea of thinking of yourself as being less, and then you're in this position of leadership, and part of the reason that you're in that position of leadership is because of competencies and skills and strengths that has kind of helped you get to the top of the organization because you're a person who can help more people. And and so you begin and you go, so what is humility, and how do you hold it in tension with thinking less of yourself and not having a negative self-image? And then sometimes you'll hear, especially among Christians, well, it's not so much thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less often. It's not being self-focused. And you hear that and go, that seems to make some sense. So, not much has been written. We have these definitions of humility that create a little bit of tension, create some questions. And so this invites study, reflection, digging, and there's not a lot written. And so one of the books that I recommended is Humilitas, John Dixon, one of the first full-length historiographies on the virtue of humility. He's claiming it's really kind of the first of its kind. And he's pretty much right. There's been more technical things written, but here's this book, and I read it. And then I learned something that I didn't know. And it's got to get out there. humility and the valuation of humility is something where this biblical idea that has some roots in the Old Testament but becomes full bloom in the New Testament really is a unique gift that Jesus and his apostles helped to bring into our world. And that needs a little unpacking, that needs a little defense, but the simple idea to take away from this is that if you didn't know it, the virtue that we call humility finds its roots from the life of Jesus Christ. And there were some ideas of humility that were floating around before, but nothing quite like what we're getting when we talk about the humility of the New Testament and really what that virtue is and what it's come to mean in Western civilization and then the impact of Western civilization. And just realizing, okay, now I'm somebody, I know the story of Jesus, and I know that he overturned the value structures of the ancient world, that the declaration of the gospel of Jesus Christ was a confrontation against the powers and the structures and the ideologies of the entire Greco-Roman world, a repudiation, a rejection, and the offering of something better. And that it was a contest of ideas where ultimately the gospel of Jesus ended up winning and converting the hearts and minds of the Roman Empire, and has gone to make Christianity the most influential worldview in the world today. So let me give you a little unpacking. So I'm making a claim that the New Testament idea of humility is something that originates in the life of Jesus and is taught by his apostles, and it really represents something new and transformative. And in fact, in my study, one of the things is that it was at the center of the contest between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the claims and gospel of a Roman Empire. And so to understand it, a great starting point is Paul's letter to the Philippians in chapter 2, where he calls the Christians in Philippi to have the same mindset of Christ. Any love, any compassion, any movement from the Spirit, be of one mind, and consider others with humility as being better than yourselves. And there's that part there where you get this idea of the humble is thinking less of yourself because others are better. But there's more going on there, and it's understandable why sometimes we get that idea. But that's the part where God's word to us was first of all God's word to them, and when we go and we talk about humility, they weren't actually saying humility. The word that Paul uses there in Philippians 2, where he calls them to humility, having the same mind as Jesus. The word there is tapaphrosune in Greek. And what's interesting is that in all the Greek literature that we have from the ancient world, and we have quite a bit, the first time that word occurs in any Greek literature that we have is Philippians 2. We call it a half-ax logomeno. It's the first occurrence, and it creates a challenge for a student of Scripture and anybody who wants to know the meaning of this word, because we don't have it going before. So here it is, and now we're going to have to do a word study, and it's a little bit different than just going back through other ancient sources that predate it and see how it gets used, and then be able to sit there and say, well, this, people use this word and it's related to these words. Well, this is the first occurrence, so this is going to take more work. Now the word is tapaphrsune, and it comes from the tapenos word group. And we would translate tapaphrsune as humility. We would translate tapenos as humble. We have tapenos in Greek literature before, so that's where we know the basic idea here is humble. But it's this idea of tapenos, humble, with phrenin, which is the phersune, which is your mind. So have the mind of the humble, so humility. And so we're starting to wrap our minds. Okay, so we know it's related to this word group. We know it's related to this word group. Okay, let's keep digging. And now as we look into this first occurrence of this call, and then you see that this word and the word group of tapenos, which includes a verb, which is tapenu, tapenos, that that word group occurs a number of times in the New Testament, and there is a consistency overall in the usage. Some of it is about quoting the tapenos word group out of the Old Testament, because the idea of some way of humble is present in the Old Testament. And it is often a word, especially tapaphrsune, that is a word that gets associated with Christian virtues that are commanded, commended, and encouraged. Compassion, humility, patience, love, joy, faith, peace. These are the qualities that should mark you as a Christian. And so we will find this word and its word group in the New Testament at a number of points where it's telling us about how now we should live. And we're beginning to say, okay, so we have the mindset of somebody who's humble. It's a quality that's encouraged by the New Testament. It finds roots in the Old Testament. Now, one of the things that you do with a word study is you look at what people besides yourself have done, and we have dictionaries where scholars have worked, and they will give you definitions of these ancient words, so that you get a little bit of help, and we're not trying to build castles all by ourselves. We've got a whole bunch of people who've gone before, done a bunch of research. We lean on it. But what's interesting is that when you look at this word tapaphrsune and tapenos, even the Bible dictionaries don't completely agree about this word. And part of it is the tension. So I haven't tried to give you yet a definition exactly, other than saying this is the word that gets translated humility. Paul's commending this idea, tapaphrsune. He says that it is the very characteristic of Jesus, who was humble and did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but he humbled himself, taking the form of a servant and even dying a slave's death, crucifixion, so that we might be saved. And he says that's the mindset that we should have. Now, we hear that and we get the overall idea, I think. I mean, that we want to be like Jesus, and in some way that means us serving and us being willing to suffer for the sake of others. But is it really about because I think of myself as being less? Or am I getting at the point that Paul has? Because our standard definition of humility, remember, is just thinking of myself as being less. So you sit there and you look at Bible dictionaries, and what you find is that there's a little bit of this disagreement. And it has to do with semantic range and words that are related to it. And humility, the tapenos word group, is closely associated with another word group, which is praus, which is gentleness. And some Bible dictionaries have said praus can sometimes be translated as humility. And other Bible dictionaries say no. Praus shouldn't be translated as humility, though there are times when the idea of praus, which we typically say is meekness, Tapeinos can be used, and it can be expressing that idea of meekness. So there is kind of that, there's this semantic range between these two word groups. And in English, we would sit there and we'd say humility, meekness, they would seem to be complementary and even go together. And we might even wonder, what really is the difference between being meek and humble? And in Greek, it's a little helpful because the idea of meekness is pictured as power under restraint. One of the pictures for it is a horse being harnessed. Incredible power, but that power held under restraint like a horse with a bridle. And meekness is that quality that holds that power so that it doesn't become out of control and abusive. But that's not quite what we mean, and that's definitely not exactly what Paul was getting at when he talked about having a mindset of humility like Jesus in his call to the Philippians. And then there's this, and this becomes really important. In Greco-Roman society, praus was a virtue. Greek and Roman moralists would celebrate this idea of power under restraint, and they would commend it as something that you should pursue if you want to live a virtuous life, if you want to pursue glory, if you want to become a type of person who is admirable and is worthy of respect. Praus is one of those things. Not necessarily the top of the thing, but it's one of those things. But when it comes to tapeinos and taprophrosune, what you find is that the Greco-Roman moralists actually sit there and they disparage the idea of tapeinos, and then later taprophrosune, as we see it later on, and they call it truly an anti-virtue. This is something despicable, wrong, looked down upon. It's appropriate for somebody to have taprophrosune as far as our standing before the gods, but you don't want to have this mentality in how you interact with one another. And you're left going, wow, that's significant. How is it that this is a virtue and this is an anti-virtue, and yet these Bible dictionaries don't seem to be paying attention much to that, and they're saying that the ideas are synonymous? Well, I had a little thing on my screen, so sorry about that. Well, that becomes something that you need to dig into. And the answer of really kind of understanding this is understanding the honor-shame culture of Greco-Roman society. And this really becomes significant that in understanding what the New Testament teaching of humility is really about. And so you go and you look at the life of Jesus, and you look at these places where he both lived the way of humility, he challenged the Greco-Roman value systems, and he called people to humility. And because we're looking at Jesus as the source of all of this stuff, that the claim is that Jesus and his apostles uniquely introduced this virtue, which beforehand wasn't seen as a virtue, and it's based on an Old Testament idea, but that's really a seed, and it becomes full bloom. It becomes full bloom as Jesus lives out the gospel. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Here are some key passages of the gospel. And in these passages, we see Jesus confronting, challenging, and offering a different way. and sometimes the Tapenos word group is there, or sometimes it's just the reality, the idea of it is there. You know how the Gentiles lord it over, and the rulers of this people are, but not so with you. And he takes a child and brings a child in his midst. Whoever wants to speak first must become last and must become servant of all. And what Jesus was doing in all of these situations was he was saying, you know the value system. Now, the problem is that you and I aren't as familiar with